The hills of eastern Washington keeps resurfacing. A bottomless pit said to be a pathway to the paranormal.
Picture this. A camera drops into a hole. Not a cave. Not a mine shaft. Not a well. A hole with no known bottom, no echo, no heat, and, according to the people who lowered that camera, no explanation. The footage that came back up lasted just over 10 minutes. Then the signal died. What those 10 minutes contained is what we're going to talk about today. But before we get to the camera, before we get to what the team saw on that screen, we need to go back to where this story actually starts. Not with a viral video, not with a Reddit thread, but with a quiet phone call on a late-night radio show made by a man who had no reason to lie and every reason to stay silent. Coast to Coast AM is not the kind of show that makes the morning newspapers. It airs in the small hours, somewhere between midnight and dawn, when the rational world has gone to sleep and the strange world is just getting warmed up. It has broadcast since the late 1980s, reaching millions of listeners across North America through a syndication network that, at its peak, covered over 600 affiliate stations. Truckers listened to it. Night shift workers. Insomniacs. People who believe there is something moving beneath the surface of the world that mainstream media refuses to name. In January 1997, a man who identified himself as Mel Waters called in. He did not sound excited. He did not have the breathless energy of someone who had rehearsed their story. He spoke plainly, the way a person speaks when they are describing something that simply happened to them, something they didn't ask for and aren't entirely sure what to do with. He said he owned land near Ellensburg, Washington. Rural land. The kind of property in Kittitas County where you can go weeks without seeing another car on the road, where the Cascade foothills flatten into high desert scrubland, where people still use their land for what land is actually for. He had been on this property for some time, and on it, had always been on it, as far as he knew, was a hole. Not a dramatic hole. Not something that looked like it belonged in a film. Just a hole. Roughly 9 feet across at the mouth, perfectly circular in a way that struck him as odd the first time he noticed it, ringed with a low barrier of old stones that the previous owners had placed there, presumably to keep livestock from stumbling into it. The local community had, for as long as anyone could remember, used the hole the way rural communities sometimes use remote spots on large properties, as a place to dump things. Old appliances. Broken tools. Dead animals. Mel said he had never thought much about it until the day he began to wonder exactly how deep it was. He started measuring the way any practical person would, with fishing line. He tied a weight to the end of a spool, lowered it in, and waited for it to hit bottom. It didn't. He tied a second spool to the end of the first and lowered again. Then a third. Then more. He told the coast-to-coast audience that he had fed more than 80,000 feet of fishing line into that hole, more than 15 miles of it, and the weighted end had never found resistance. The radio host, Art Bell, paused. 15 miles. For context, the deepest cave system ever confirmed on Earth is Veriovkina Cave in the Republic of Georgia, which drops to approximately 7,257 feet, a little over a mile. The deepest borehole ever drilled by human beings, the Kola Superdeep borehole in northwestern Russia, reached 40,230 feet after 24 years of continuous drilling. That is roughly 7.6 miles. And it had to stop, not because they ran out of money or ambition, but because the rock at that depth had been so thoroughly transformed by heat and pressure that it behaved less like solid material and more like hot putty. Drilling instruments were destroyed. Temperatures exceeded 300 degrees Celsius at depth. The project was abandoned in 1992. Mel Waters, using a fishing reel and a weight, claimed to have gone twice as deep without touching anything. He didn't try to explain it. He just reported it. He also reported other things, quieter, stranger things. That birds would not fly directly over the hole. That his dogs refused to approach it, stopping a full 20 to 30 feet from the edge and refusing to be coaxed any closer. That on still days, the air immediately above the opening felt different, denser, he said, like the atmosphere near the hole had a different composition than the air 3 feet away. That items dropped in, trash, debris, a refrigerator he mentioned specifically, never made a sound upon landing. Not a distant thud. Not a reverberation. Nothing. As though the objects had not landed, but had simply ceased. And he reported one more thing, almost as an afterthought. That after the broadcast, someone came for him. Before we follow what happened to Mel Waters, It's worth standing still for a moment and looking at the land itself, because the physical geography of Kittitas County is genuinely strange, and understanding it matters. The area around Ellensburg sits in a high valley carved by the Yakima River, hemmed in by the Cascade Range to the west and the Columbia Plateau to the east. The geology here is dominated by basalt, specifically the Columbia River Basalt Group, one of the largest continental flood basalt formations on Earth. Between approximately 17 and 6 million years ago, an extraordinary series of volcanic eruptions released massive volumes of lava across what is now eastern Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. This wasn't the explosive, mountain-forming kind of volcanism. This was effusive, lava pouring from long fissure vents and spreading in sheets across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, layer after layer, building up a basalt plateau in places more than 3 miles thick. Flood basalt formations like this create unusual underground terrain. As lava flows cool, they form networks of tubes, chambers, and vertical channels. Lava tubes, formed when the outer shell of a flow solidifies while molten rock continues flowing through the interior, eventually draining and leaving a hollow passage, are documented extensively in this region. Some of them are substantial. Ape Cave, on the southern flank of Mount St. Helens in neighboring Skamania County, is one of the longest lava tubes in the continental United States at over 13,000 feet. Smaller, undocumented formations exist throughout the region. None of this explains 15 miles of depth. The basalt formations in Kittitas County, however deep, do not penetrate the mantle. The laws of geology remain unbroken. But it does mean this: the ground beneath eastern Washington is not solid. It is layered, tubular, fractured, and in places genuinely hollow in ways that are not always mapped, not always understood, and not always stable. When Mel Waters described a hole that seemed to have no bottom, he was describing it from a farm in a region where the earth quite literally has cavities the size of subway tunnels running through it. The hole he described may not be what he thought it was. But the landscape in which he placed it is not an unreasonable landscape for strange underground formations to exist. Manastash Ridge, specifically, the area most associated with the supposed location of Mel's Hole, running east to west along the southern edge of Kittitas County, is geologically complex. It marks the transition between the Cascade foothills and the Columbia Plateau, an area of faulting, folding, and volcanic intrusion. The ridge itself is a prominent anticline, a fold in the rock layers where pressure has pushed material upward. Anticlines can fracture. Fractures create vertical passages. Passages can go deep. None of this is mystical. All of it is real. Mel Waters did not make another public statement for 5 years. According to his own account, given during a second appearance on Coast to Coast AM in 2002, the period following his 1997 broadcast was not quiet. He described vehicles without markings appearing near his property. He described men he didn't recognize walking the perimeter of his land. He described, in careful and reluctant detail, a day when he returned home to find his property blocked by officials in protective gear, hazmat suits, he said, who informed him that access was restricted due to a nearby aviation incident. No wreckage. No emergency response team. No news coverage of any crash in Kittitas County that week. Just men with clipboards and authority, and a reason that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Then came what he described as an offer. He was approached, he said, by individuals he believed were connected to the federal government. They proposed financial compensation. He cited a figure, a modest annual payment, in exchange for his silence and his departure from the United States. He was told, more or less directly, that refusing this arrangement would result in complications. Legal complications. He mentioned an accusation, something about a laboratory on his land, that he denied but feared would be enough to destroy him regardless of its truth. He left. He went to Australia, he said. He was gone for years. When he returned in 2002, something about him had changed. Listeners who had heard the original broadcast noted it immediately. His voice was flatter. His recall was inconsistent. He described gaps, periods he could not account for, procedures he did not remember consenting to, scars whose origins he couldn't explain. He was hesitant in a way that the 1997 caller had not been. That caller had been matter-of-fact, almost bored by the strangeness of what he was describing. The 2002 caller sounded like a man trying to remember a dream. He did, however, add something new. He spoke of a second hole. Not in Washington. In Nevada. In the desert. He said this hole was under active surveillance. That access to its location was controlled in ways that the Ellensburg property had never been. That what he had learned about this Nevada site, through means he declined to specify, was considerably more disturbing than anything he had encountered at the first location. He stopped short of describing what that meant. And then he was gone again. There is no verifiable record of Mel Waters beyond those 2 broadcasts. Researchers and curious citizens who attempted to trace him found nothing. No property records matching his description in Kittitas County, no passport records, no public documentation. Either Mel Waters was extraordinarily careful about his privacy in an era before that was difficult, or the name itself was a pseudonym, or, as some believe, records that once existed no longer do. The absence of documentation does not, by itself, mean anything sinister happened. People vanish from the public record for many reasons, most of them mundane. What makes the Waters case unusual is the specificity of the story combined with the completeness of the erasure. He did not fade away gradually. There was simply, at some point, nothing. For roughly 2 decades, Mel's Hole was a niche piece of paranormal folklore, well known in certain circles, referenced in databases of unusual phenomena, discussed occasionally in late-night radio retrospectives, but not widely known. It was the kind of story that people who were already interested in unexplained events knew about. General audiences didn't. That changed around 2021 and 2022, when a combination of algorithmic amplification and genuine human curiosity brought the story to an entirely new audience. TikTok users discovered it. YouTube channels explored it. Reddit threads on forums devoted to paranormal investigation and unexplained geography began cataloging every detail of the original broadcasts, cross-referencing them with satellite imagery and topographic maps of Kittitas County. The turning point came when a user on one of these forums, operating under an anonymous handle, posted what they claimed were GPS coordinates corresponding to the described location near Manistash Ridge. They attached a satellite image showing what appeared to be a circular clearing in otherwise dense forest cover, an area roughly the right size, with no trees, no roads, no visible reason for its existence. Users who downloaded the image and geo-referenced it against known topography said the location was consistent with the general area Mel had described. Then, and this is where the story always accelerates, the satellite images changed. Google Maps and other public satellite services use a process of continuous image updating, and certain areas are deliberately obscured for security reasons. Military installations, intelligence facilities, and some government properties appear blurred or pixelated on public mapping tools. This is documented, it is policy, and it is not a secret. The National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency works with mapping services to ensure that sensitive locations are not clearly visible to anyone with a laptop. When users returned to the coordinates that had been shared online, the image had changed. The circular clearing was still visible, just barely, but the surrounding area had been replaced with lower-resolution imagery. Not black. Not obviously censored. Just blurrier. Different from what had been there before. For the community that had been tracking this story, that was sufficient. The argument went, why would a random patch of scrubland in Kittitas County be worth degrading in satellite resolution? Why would a hole that doesn't exist require the same treatment as a classified airbase? The answer that most people did not reach for, but which is the most rational? It probably doesn't. Satellite imagery updates constantly. Resolution varies by area based on when images were captured, by which commercial satellite passed overhead, by atmospheric conditions on the day of imaging. A change in image quality over a remote patch of eastern Washington is not, by itself, evidence of government suppression. But it felt like evidence. And in the environment the internet had created around the story, feeling like evidence was enough to send people into the field. In 2023, a team of 5 people traveled to the Manistash Ridge area with equipment that was, by any measure, serious. They brought a custom-rigged lowering system, a motorized winch mounted to a portable steel frame capable of deploying several hundred feet of high-tension cable at a controlled rate. Attached to the cable was a purpose-built camera housing, a waterproof, pressure-resistant unit containing a 4K low-light camera, thermal and infrared sensors, a magnetometer for detecting changes in magnetic field strength, and accelerometers to measure movement and orientation. The housing was designed to continue transmitting data via cable even if wireless signal was disrupted. The team included 2 people with engineering backgrounds, one with experience in industrial inspection, the kind of work that involves sending cameras into pipelines and structural voids, one documentary filmmaker, and one person described as a skeptic, someone whose explicit role was to argue against extraordinary interpretations of whatever they found. They did not live stream. They did not announce their departure. They planned to record everything and evaluate it afterward. What they found when they reached the coordinates was a clearing, roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across. No vegetation growing within it. The surrounding forest came right up to the edge without entering, which is unusual. Plants do not typically respect invisible boundaries. The soil within the clearing was compacted and pale, different in color and texture from the forest floor a few feet away. At the center of the clearing was a hole. They did not measure its diameter precisely, but the team estimated it at roughly 8 to 10 feet across. The edges were clean, not crumbling or eroded as you would expect from an old pit, but well-defined, almost sheer. Looking down, they could see the walls, smooth basalt, darker as it descended, disappearing into black after a few feet. They set up the winch frame at the edge. They ran a systems check on the camera housing. Everything nominal. They began the descent. The first thing they noted was the silence. Not ordinary underground quiet, the muffled sound of soil absorbing noise, but something more complete. They described it as a feeling more than a sound, a quality of the air that made conversation feel intrusive, like speaking in a room where someone is asleep. The walls, as the camera descended, were smooth in a way that raised questions. Natural lava tubes typically show flow marks, vesicles from gas bubbles trapped in cooling rock, irregular surfaces from where material has shifted over thousands of years. These walls showed almost none of that. They were not perfectly machined, this wasn't metal, but they had a uniformity that was difficult to attribute to purely natural formation processes. At around 200 feet, the temperature sensors registered an anomaly. It was getting colder. This requires some explanation. Geothermal gradient, the rate at which temperature increases with depth, varies by location but averages roughly 25 to 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer in stable continental crust. In the Pacific Northwest, where residual volcanic heat affects the subsurface, it can be higher. In any normal underground environment, descending means encountering warmer temperatures. Not this one. The camera housing's external thermometer had read approximately 12 degrees Celsius at the surface, a cool autumn morning. By 200 feet, it was reading 4 degrees. By 300 feet, it was reading -2. The team watched this and said nothing for a long moment. Then the lights began. Small, intermittent flashes, deep in the column below the camera. Not reflections from the drone's own lights. The team confirmed this by cutting the lights momentarily and watching the flashes persist. They were coming from further down. They pulsed in an irregular rhythm that one team member, listening to the audio recording later, described as resembling a biological process. Not mechanical. Not lightning. Something that had interval but not precision. At approximately 400 feet, the magnetometer began registering anomalous readings. Magnetic field strength fluctuated rapidly, in patterns that did not correspond to any known geological source. A static magnetic anomaly, like one caused by a buried iron-rich formation, would show up as a consistent deviation. What the sensors recorded was oscillating, field strength spiking and dropping in rapid succession, as though something below were generating and then suppressing a magnetic field in cycles. The compass display on the monitoring unit began to drift. At 580 feet, the camera captured something. The team reviewed this footage frame by frame after the fact. What appears in the images, and this needs to be stated carefully, is a shape. It is tall and narrow. It is positioned between the camera lens and the far wall of the shaft. It is not clearly defined. The image shows a region of differential density in the space, something that is not the wall and not empty air, occupying a roughly human-shaped volume. It does not move. It does not approach. It is simply present in frames where, seconds earlier, nothing was present. 3 frames. Then the feed cut out. The cable went slack. When they reeled it back up, the housing was gone. The cable end showed no signs of having been cut or pulled. It had simply separated from the housing at the connection point, a point that had been load-tested before deployment. Whatever had been at the end of the cable was not there anymore. The team had backup recordings. Secondary data logs from the cable-mounted sensors. partial video from a secondary wide-angle camera that had been recording the descent from above. When they compiled and reviewed this material over the following days, several things became clear. The temperature anomaly was real and consistent across multiple independent sensors. It was not an instrument malfunction. The sensors had been calibrated and both thermistors in the housing recorded matching values. Cold air pooling in a confined underground space is not unheard of, but the rate of temperature drop recorded here was significantly faster than would be expected from passive cooling. The magnetic field oscillations were similarly consistent across the magnetometer data. The pattern did not match any geological phenomenon in the published literature that the team members could identify. It bore some resemblance to the magnetic signatures produced by electrical current flowing through a conductor, but identifying a source for that current, at that depth, in that location, was not possible. The audio recording, captured by the housing's external microphone, showed something that no one had expected. At frequencies below 100 Hz, infrasound, there were patterns. Not random noise. Not the kind of broadband rumble you get from wind or water. Structured patterns, repeating, with a regularity that audio analysis software flagged as having a periodicity of approximately 17 cycles per second. This is worth noting. 18.98 Hz is a frequency that researcher Vic Tandy identified in the late 1990s as capable of causing discomfort, disorientation, and visual disturbances in humans exposed to it. His work, published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in 1998, documented instances where standing waves at infrasound frequencies produced by mechanical sources created environments in which people reported sensations consistent with supernatural encounters, peripheral visual phenomena, feelings of unease, the sense of presence. His research has been replicated in part and remains a legitimate area of acoustic investigation. The team was above the source. They were not inside the shaft when these frequencies were being generated. But the person who had stood nearest to the hole during the descent reported having felt, at one point, a sudden tightness in the chest and a brief visual disturbance at the edge of their peripheral vision. They had attributed it to anxiety at the time. In retrospect, they were less certain. The shape at 580 feet remains unexplained. It may be a compression artifact in the video. Digital cameras can produce visual distortions under certain conditions of electromagnetic interference, and the magnetic field anomalies recorded at that depth were significant. It may be a feature of the wall catching light in an unexpected way. It may be something else. The team did not claim to know what it was. They presented the footage and presented the data and declined to draw firm conclusions. That restraint, as it happened, did not protect them. The footage went online through a private hosting platform initially, shared among the team and a small group of researchers. Within 48 hours, it had been downloaded, mirrored, and spread to several major platforms. Within 72 hours, the takedowns had begun. Copies were removed from YouTube under copyright claims filed by an entity that no one could identify. The claimed rights holder had no public profile, no registered works, no digital footprint beyond the takedown filings themselves. Reddit threads discussing the footage were locked or deleted. Discord servers where the video had been shared experienced sudden data loss. One team member's personal cloud storage account, where they had backed up the raw footage, returned an error message stating that the files did not exist, despite the user having uploaded them personally. These actions are, in some ways, more documentable than the footage itself, because platform moderation actions leave traces, and researchers who track content moderation patterns noted the speed and consistency of the removals as unusual. Most viral footage, even controversial footage, persists online through mirrors and archives long after the original is removed. This footage had a half-life measured in hours before each new copy was also targeted. The team stopped posting publicly. 2 of the 5 members deleted their social media accounts entirely. The remaining 3 have not provided any further interviews or statements. The land near Manistash Ridge became inaccessible to casual visitors. Hikers who traveled to the area described encountering unfamiliar vehicles and personnel who turned them away without providing identification or explanation. Satellite imagery of the coordinates returned low-resolution results. The situation was, in short, the same as it had been after Mel Waters disappeared in 1997, as though the same script were being run a second time, updated only for the technology of a later era. Here is what is verifiable. The geological terrain of Kittitas County, Washington, is consistent with the existence of deep vertical formations. The Columbia River Basalt Group creates underground structures that are not fully mapped. Lava tubes, fracture zones, and volcanic conduits in this region can extend to significant depths. The Kola super-deep borehole established that human drilling technology, at its most advanced, could not penetrate beyond approximately 7.6 miles before the physical properties of the Earth made further progress impossible. A whole 17 times that depth is not geologically plausible by any known mechanism. Mel Waters was either exaggerating, mistaken in his measurements, or describing something that falls outside what we currently understand about subterranean geology. Acoustic research into infrasound, specifically the frequency range below 20 Hz, has documented measurable psychological effects on human subjects. People in environments with high infrasound exposure report visual disturbances, feelings of presence, and unease. This is documented in peer-reviewed literature. If a natural or artificial source of infrasound existed in or near a vertical shaft in eastern Washington, it could produce experiences that felt supernatural without being so. Cold air anomalies in underground formations, while unusual, are not unheard of. Wind Cave in South Dakota, for example, is named for the air currents that flow through it, caused by pressure differentials between the cave interior and the surface atmosphere. Unusual thermal behavior in poorly understood subterranean formations is documentable without invoking extraordinary causes. The magnetic anomalies are harder to explain. Oscillating magnetic fields at the pattern described would require either a natural geomagnetic phenomenon not commonly observed in stable continental crust, or some kind of current-carrying structure at depth. Neither of these is impossible. Neither has been confirmed. The shape at 580 feet is genuinely ambiguous. Video artifacts under conditions of electromagnetic interference are well documented. Pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive faces and figures in ambiguous visual information, is equally well documented. The brain is extraordinarily good at constructing a figure out of noise. That is not a dismissal. It is a caution. What is not verifiable, what cannot currently be verified, is whether any of these observations amount to a coherent phenomenon. The whole may exist. The anomalies may be real. The connection between them, the framework that makes this a single story rather than a collection of unrelated oddities, requires a theory that no one has yet produced in a form that can be tested. Mel Waters may have been describing something real, imperfectly understood and poorly measured. He may have been describing something he believed was real but wasn't. He may have been describing something real that was subsequently suppressed by parties with reasons to suppress it. These possibilities are not equally likely, but none of them can be eliminated. Here is the question that this story keeps returning to, the one that makes it different from most paranormal folklore. Most of these stories reach a point where the evidence runs dry and you're left with a claim and no way to test it. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster. Area 51 in its early years. At some point you run out of physical world and you're left with belief or disbelief, and not much in between. Mel's Hole is different, because the physical world it inhabits is real and accessible.